So we have an hour in here to kind of continue, for some of us, what's been going on for the last 2.5, nearly 3 days, and for others, a more recent kind of journey in and through, and because of your conversation to us and with us, that we would try and set this up not as a Q&A, and maybe not even as one large circle for very long, but perhaps to place some thoughts, images, questions into the space that we could then, we're kind of already formed in these sort of little clusters. We could follow up more intimately. There is a meal in an hour's time, which is shared, or which we're inviting anyone to stay for this evening. It's ticketed, and there are tickets left. I don't know how. Do we need to say how much the tickets are?
So I think the tickets are £4, or if you're concession, £3.50. But I don't know how many we have left at the moment, so we can find out when it comes closer to the time, and you know how hungry you are and how interested.
It looks like it has an Indian theme.
There's curry and dal and popdom and things like that.
And so one thing that's been passed around the kind of circle to me this way from Laura is saying how exciting it was to for someone who is resident here to notice how much permission there is now to talk about the voice, or the, and that maybe we've been more concerned with ideas around movement vocals, but the voice is part of that too. Do you want to say what that was, and that could maybe begin?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm interested in the process of orality, so finding language that comes from the body as opposed to maybe a more cerebral process, for want of better words. And so partly interested in that as a different way of knowing, like as a different knowledge process, as well as thinking about its potential as a regenerative force in performance or outside of performance, and feeling as though maybe this is I don't know how other people feel about this, but my observation is that there's a certainly amongst dancing contexts, there's a comfort maybe with being strange in your body or making a strangeness out of your body, which I don't know if that's also felt as being as allowed with sound. I think we're still quite inhibited by strange sounds that we're capable of making, and how kind of primal that can be, and what that kind of ignites energetically between us. And I felt my sensory empathy when you came in front of us and started making that sound. My whole body was like, you know, like really kind of went somewhere right into my belly, and that's what I'm interested in, like keeping that fire going together.
I'll just say one thing. What I thought was really interesting while I was preparing to come here is that I was thinking, well, one of the things that writers deal with is this issue of absence that I was explaining. You know, you're outside of the process quite quickly, and you have to sort of find your way back into it. But of course, the mute dancer's body is what you are dealing with, is the tradition of the dancer having a mute body. And because there is so much of sounding going on in contemporary dance, I figured, well, I'm going to arrive, you're going to be voice exhausted. Because I figured, so I didn't even mention the mute dancer's body, because I thought, well, no, because it's so much what contemporary dance does is to address, also the issue of the voicing through the body, if you like. And sometimes it's got language and other times it's sounding. So I'm quite surprised to hear that after 3 days, you just breathing, but you're not, that's really interesting to me. Yeah.
I mean, we've been talking.
I would disagree.
Yes,
I think, but I agree that we've been using, we've been trying to make things understandable, or we've been trying to reach understandings, and I think that comment about strangeness, allowing strangeness or poetic understanding to wash over you, this beautiful image at the end of these words, kind of like clouds, and maybe there's more space for that. Should burst into song now. Okay.
In relation to it, Aroti Shahad was the feeling of permission to move from Iaith at llall, a fi'n teimlo so excited bod fi'n medru hefyd wneud hynna. A wedyn y politics of other languages and the object o'r iaith arall yn y gofod, just, oherwydd o'n i'n teimlo just mor gryf. So, diolch.
It doesn't really help to make you understandable, though.
Ond beth fi'n dweud yw bod dwi'n iaith ddim yn gwneud na ti'n deall fi. Language is about mynegu. Nid yn gwneud na ti yn deall beth dwi'n dweud. A dyna ble mae politics o'r iaith yn dod i mewn. In a very serious way, actually.
There is this thing of when we listen to a language we don't understand, what it does if we remain open to that experience, immediately we know what we don't know. Immediately we know, oh God, I don't know that language. So immediately we have a limit to our world. Like if we didn't want to know it before, now we have it, and we have it in this way and with this language. And so there's something very clear and powerful about that obscuration, if you like, that happens in the lack of knowledge when we listen to another language, which is really reflecting back on the limits in our experience. Yeah.
But also for me, there's another way. I mean, it's a bit hard for me to judge because I actually understand. Mostly. But I do think when I hear other people speaking in a language that I don't understand, I kind of enjoy the quality of it and the kind of sensuality of it and the kind of physicality of it and how much I get through the expression. And it's like maybe we don't, I understand also the politics of, in a way, understanding and not understanding. I can't kind of take that out, but there's also something beneath that as well of like, why do we prioritize that way of understanding? You know, for me that's not so important. You know, I love to hear people speak in a language between themselves or to a group that I...
But you are bilingual, and a lot of people that are monolingual.
Well, I'm semi-bilingual.
You're semi-bilingual. But at least you have it in your ears, even if you might not have it in your mouth. And like I'm often in French-speaking countries, and there's a sort of blocked terror about not understanding. But what you're describing is that beautiful quality of the physical listening, in a way, that you are able to engage in a physical apprehension of a language and its sounds.
And the importance of embodying that as a language that is dear to you, or your first language, or the kind of integrity and kind of importance of that in the kind of whole for you.
Yeah, I see a lot of how effective we use time and be effective with how we express ourselves in making ourselves clear in a language that we both understand. Because this relationship is actually, it's gonna take time before we can really tap into each other's sensitivity, or I don't know, or what we want to make us to understand from each other, which is another level from as creating a relationship, which is really valuable for me.
Wouldn't the question be where are you from?
I'm from Aberystwyth.
And what was the language you were speaking?
It's Welsh.
So that kind of endows you and your statement with the politics?
Yeah.
Because she's not speaking the language just so that you don't understand it. She's asking you a question, which is more than just, oh, it sounds really nice.
Well, Britain is really interesting in terms of the indigenous languages and the politics of it, and British Sign Language, which I find very interesting from a movement point of view and a linguistic point of view, and the politics of that being part, that is an official British language, how many people can speak in that language, can express themselves and understand someone. And I'm German, I can think in English and in German, and I'm always aware of what I am gaining or losing by going from one language to the other. But it's interesting to me with British Sign Language how I gain something completely different, and at the same time I understand that there's a primal grammar that happens, even if it's transposed into the body completely and not just into the voice box and my expressions and gestures in a pedestrian way. But in Germany, you don't have another language that is an official language like you do in South Africa or in Belgium, so that's a completely different bilingual experience that I've never had. That here there are other languages and dominant languages, and what that does to your experience and your politics and your thinking, I find that very interesting.
You said something about language killing.
In relation to the shibboleth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought that was quite,
Yeah.
not crazy.
Yes.
Yeah. And so did that power.
Yeah, and the fact that in a way, in that sense, then the idea of a first tongue or originary tongue to your identity might be sitting so deep in your body and in your jaws and in your muscles, and how you've developed that entire brain related to that language, how that might kill you at a point of whether the confrontation is basically based in the knowledge that it only takes the placing of the tongue in a slightly different way and you are a foreigner, that is it. And I think that is such a powerful thing that to be thinking about, to imagine. And of course, in a less dramatic way, you have everything to do with checking one's English for BBC English, Standard English, all those things that are much less dramatic, if you like, but still play a part in that idea of, how we want to sort of regulate what's good and what's bad about a type of language. But at its worst, it's murder, So.
But I think that also connects to a really potent and potential of language in lots of oral cultures. There's this concept of language carrying such risk and responsibility, because it's a sort of thinking about absence and presence, and if there's no written form of writing, you're always very you can't get away from what you've said. You're there saying it, you take responsibility for those words, and you kind of you follow them in a sense, and that there's that, because of that presence, there's a kind of materiality that reminded me of, yesterday we heard a talk about atmospheres and balloons, and this kind of the invisible becoming visible in some sense. And it's been very much, I've felt it in this building, and we've been thinking about the space between ourselves and the other, and what is in this kind of relation, and then that becoming beginning to imagine the air as an element that has this material kind of solidity, that these words, you know, it allows the vibrations that carry our words. It is that contact between us. It is the breath that we're all breathing. And I like that, I don't know, this isn't a finished thought really, I'm kind of, but how that risk and responsibility is sort of carried by like the material between us, and that we're constantly making those risks in this atmosphere. I don't know if that makes sense. But
can I carry that thought a bit further? I was just thinking about two different aspects of responsibility. You described being responsible for the things I say, being responsible to myself, to this identity that I carry around. But some of the conversation around sound and your beautiful graphic of the migration of sound patterns and missing things, and this notion of phoneme that you introduced, which is not a strange word to me, but I've just been meditating about it a bit more in this conversation, the idea that little fragments of speech, of sound, of breath kind of evolve and have a life of their own and are temporarily in our bodies, but don't reside in our bodies. The idea that sound patterns are have an existence that's kind of beyond us, and that moves through us for a time, and then will find new ways of configuring themselves, might have their own agenda, as any evolving entity does. Some might die out or be killed out by other phonemes. So there's this, I don't know, that was maybe leading me towards a sense of another sense of responsibility, which is less that I'm responsible for being held accountable to myself, and more being responsible for these things, these materials which are circulating through me, which are in my care at this time, but don't belong to me, or aren't kind of coexistent with me. The words that I have available to me are have their own circulation and their own existence.
I'd like to add to what Caroline just said before Nicole gets in there. Nicola gets in there, which is that we're talking about the responsibility of language, and I think I'd like to say something about the irresponsibility of language from my experience. So I was born in Sri Lanka, and we migrated to Australia when I was 9 years old, and one of the first things I did when we went to Australia was that I said to my parents, I'm never going to speak Sinhalese again, as an act of belonging, as a way of trying to fit into this new land, really, and I haven't since. And when I tell people that, there is this kind of shocking, like it's like a shocking thing, you know, like, but you've given up your mother tongue, which I did. And I made that choice as a 9-year-old. And then I found out very recently that in the 60s and 70s there was a big kind of movement in Sri Lanka to reclaim Sinhalese as the main language, as opposed to English after the colonization of the country by the British. And that my father's family were really instrumental in holding on to English as their main language. Actually, there was my aunt is the first PhD candidate. She's an English professor, and that somehow I had somehow I felt like I had carried on this thing that I didn't know had happened in the 60s and 70s, that no one had spoken about it, where that there had been a propagation of English, and that when I went to an English-speaking country, I too continued that in my own way, and that it had somehow been passed through to me wordlessly. And that actually the reason that my aunt and my father and that side of the family had strongly felt that English should be the main language is because of the power of English in a third world country. And if the next generation could really study English from a very young age as opposed to Sinhalese, that they could leave, really, somehow. They had more freedom. And I recognized that as I knew that if I could make English my best thing somehow, that I could slip into this country differently. So I experimented with my accent, for months, to really sound Australian. And now I sound really British because I choose to sound British, actually. And it's something that I put on, in a way. And something that I have had the privilege of choosing and continuing. So I see language really as a sort of privilege, and I feel I've been very irresponsible somehow with my mother tongue. And also, I sort of excelled in English literature.
I think you immediately remind me of Gayatri Spivak, the Indian-American philosopher, who's worked a lot with issues of Indian languages and education and literacy. She's a pretty dense philosopher. Deconstruction is pretty dense. However, dense in a good way, not in a sort of dense way. She has a very beautiful interview around Beckett at one point. I'll try and find a reference to it. That I've used for some work of mine, where she basically says, thinking about Beckett and the politics in relation to Irish, where she says you have to reject your mother tongue, that to sort of accept a process of sort of de-domination, if you like, that you can free. I know that you might say, well, my issue is exactly the reverse because I went into domineering language, but that's not what she's pointing to. She's pointing to this idea that we have that the mother tongue is so tied to the body, so tied to the internal being, if you like, that you can't separate. If you separate, it's a crime to yourself. And she has very beautiful, powerful arguments regarding this process of rejection as a way of therefore becoming aware of the process of language acquisition, aware of one's sort of positioning in the world and in relation to language and power. So that would be a very sort of typical Spivak positioning to take, but I think it's very interesting as well, because to at least be able to choose whether we are imprisoned by one's mother tongue or whether we are sort of opening ourselves out of it and yet choosing it from time to time, whatever. I think these are sort of important issues of behavior, like you've just described, of mobility, of all sorts of both emotive and intellectual ways of being in the world. So I'll find you that reference because, first of all, she's great. She's called Spivak, and you'll find lots of things regarding transnational citizenship and stuff like that, which often touches on language. But that one especially is beautiful.
While you were talking, I just had this moment of thinking what my parents would say about what you're saying. And whilst they would agree about this idea of mobility and accessing place and opportunity and location and education, actually, I sense, and I don't know without asking them, that on an emotive level, that they would feel that a meaning has been lost in the process of choosing to give up that language. That on one level they would perhaps think innately, because you'd had it at some point, it's something that you've never lost, or it's something that you've never given up because it is not a possibility for you to actually do so, or anyone. But also that there is a meaning that is lost, that there is a type of meaning that is transferred or present in language, not just in the connotations that ripple out from it, but in its very existence, all the way from its existence on the paper to how the pen or the instrument or the hand has to move in order to articulate those things physically, let alone how the mouth and all the different elements have to move in order to deliver that type of sound in the first place. And that somewhere through that there is a huge emotive connection, but a huge thing about meaning being ingrained in every element of that as well. so I can only imagine, maybe it's my standpoint, I don't know, but I was thinking on my parents that they would perceive it as being a huge loss, as that it was tragic, in fact. And that's not a bite at you, that's just what you've spurred me to think. And I think on a very, without having thought about it more than that, I feel a kind of a real resonance with that notion as well. Because I mean, my first language is English. However, in the home I was also brought up with Gujarati. My register is appallingly low. However, the language is really important to me. And then of course it does so many other things, and politically it does so many other things as well. But yeah,
There is what they say about the first sense we hear in the womb being sound, and then of course if you think about the languages that are spoken by your parents or your mother to be, if you like, at that point, there is a point where we can say, well, there might be some sonic associations that you have that therefore are totally, genuinely preverbal, that are genuinely in a sort of sonic dimension, and yet are actually perhaps connected to the life she leads and the places where they are and the language she speaks. So from that point of view, it's quite an interesting sort of question. I think that what Spivak in this case is meaning is perhaps the conscious level. I think what you're saying is very interesting from the point of view of vibratory dimensions of sound that might lead us. Perhaps we've lost that language. Politically, that could be very problematic for entire communities. I'm just looking now at the individual speaker, and there might be sonic, vibratory openness that you sort of carry with you. They're not connected to language acquisition in the same way. They might not be about recognition because you cannot necessarily recognize it if you haven't had it. But there's a very interesting level there about the depth of linguistic sound prior to it being understood as language, I think. Very interesting.
And I just wanted to add to that, you know, when we think about tragedies as well, like how we hold our tragedies, how we wear them, how we expose them, how we play with them. And often when I think of scars on the body, but I think my scars are really about language. And I just want to say that.
So I might jump in. So this thought was in my head from a little earlier in the discussion, but it relates particularly to Amara talking about finding her accent in speaking English, which is, I was thinking about the degree to which we can't hear our own voices, the degree to which I can't hear my own voice. And I was thinking about it when you were speaking about the shibboleth and that something in our the way we've learned to use our musculature means that we pronounce in particular ways. And I thought about when I was a kid, when I was really little, I had a thing about accents. I liked the idea that I would be able to imitate accents, different accents. And I remember very strongly, like being with friends at school or at home, I can't remember, and we would try accents, and I would listen to a friend and think, God, he's so stupid, he can't do it. You know, it just doesn't sound like that. It should sound like I can hear in my head what it should sound like, and then I would try to do it, and I would sound the same as him, and I couldn't do it either, and I couldn't understand. I couldn't understand how I couldn't make the sound in the way I wanted to, and experience this huge kind of disconnection between, or dislocation perhaps, between how I was receiving and digesting, expressing the same language, and my ability to create those sounds. And you know, I guess it's also similar to that classic thing of hearing your own voice recorded and kind of being horrified by what you sound like, and you sound like this kind of alien version of yourself. there's I guess two sets of things. There's several things. There's the what my muscles are able to produce and what their parameters are currently, and how this jump between what I hear and what I think I hear, the sound I produce and what I think I might be producing. And of course, some people are incredibly skilled at accents, aren't they? I've never mastered it. I think after that traumatic experience, at the age of 7 or something, I gave up. So it's interesting to hear you saying that you committed many months to this. I've always liked the idea of working with accent experts who work with actors. I think maybe that should be on my bucket list. I should commit to that at some
Do you know
point.
what I can't do and I can do is I'm incredibly empathetic, so I pick up accents by accident. But if somebody asks me to do an accent, I can't actually do it. To the degree that I picked up somebody's stutter, because I've just been with, which was not good. But I didn't mean to do it. I just had spent that much time listening and hearing them speak that I just went like that. But then if you asked me to do a stutter now, I couldn't do it. Not without trying really, really hard. But I only said that because of what you're talking about your ability to do those things or not do those things.
It's training, it's focusing on it. It's what she did.
Sorry, so that's it.
It's training and focusing on it, I think. You can teach yourself. I worked on my Birmingham accent.
That's you, right.
That was it. The mummy holidays.
Is that the one sentence?
Yeah. I spent a lot of time on that one. I'm a slow learner. Yeah.
One sentence a year.
Yeah, I can get used to days.
I really enjoyed your keeping it together with the use of the rhythm and breathing for lots of layered reasons. First one was that sense of being on the rhythm was so much like being on a train, ongoing and going on and journeying. So immediately, first thing I flashed to was Nigel Charnock's death, and just before he dying, and one of us said, this is quite a journey, isn't it, Nigel? And Nigel turning really fast saying, I'm not on a journey, I'm dying. Like, cut that. So that's the first thing I was thinking of, but then I was also thinking about the paradox of us here, in that a lot of the work that I sense we're doing is about undoing the keeping it together. It's like letting it go. At the same time, the paradox is that I'm having to stay up for 4 days and keep it together. And I was really aware of that during your talk, because I found myself really wanting to go to sleep because I'm so tired, and yet so fascinated at the same time. So that moment for me was very layered in terms of what I was getting a lot of thinking and pleasure.
It reminded me of the work of John Giorno. Very manifesto. It really creeped into my because every time you repeat it, it means another thing, and it comes from another corner. It's very invasive in a way. It's very powerful.
I think that there's Giorno, but perhaps also Bernard Heidsieck. I mean, a French poet who worked a lot with technology, but also has a very tight way of sort of presenting voice and voice in the machine, and in a way you think, well, is this voice become a machine, or what's happening? When is this going to stop? And in fact, when I'm in the middle of it, I'm like, when am I going to stop? Because once you develop the way that you know how to breathe through it, the first times I did, I nearly passed out because I didn't know how to breathe. So far too deep, so you need to develop the way you sort of work the breath to sort of hold it. But once you do that, I could go for a long time. So then it really becomes about how and why and what are the events that might interrupt this or whatever. What I wanted to do with this piece was to set up a type of claustrophobia.
Mhm.
So that in a way there is nothing, the breath is totally taken up by language, and that's terrifying. Because in a way the break is sort of exactly what we need. But to fill that up is sort of horrible. So it's very good that you all felt sort of horrified by it as well, and at the same time caught up, because I think it is quite a somatic piece because of that. Because there's no room to be, and yet there's this sort of so
it's very recognizable because it taps into fear, feelings of fear we have. It's like, I don't know if you know emotional freedom technique, but you start with tapping into the problem, and then your body feels what the problem is, and then you can talk yourself out of it.
Yeah.
But this kind of manifesto has the power to actually tap into the fear,
Right.
and then you can build up a solution, which is very...
Yeah, that's interesting.
I experienced it differently. I didn't feel claustrophobic at all.
Okay.
I felt it meditative, and I felt it was very similar to mindfulness of breathing, where I felt like instead of it having any meaning, it just became part of the breath. And when I was hearing you speaking the breath, it was turning into how you were breathing in and out, and I was doing it with you.
Yeah.
And so for me it felt more, not relaxing, but otherworldly perhaps.
That's really beautiful, you should say that, because I find that piece is difficult to do.
Yeah.
But the third piece in that series is very much about calling on the breath that, in a way, somebody said, connects us. And I came with the idea of the breath for this talk primarily because I felt, well, if there's one thing you certainly do a lot, is you have to breathe so much, I would imagine, because of movement. So you have to sort of stay connected to a type of breathing, which we also do in relation to performance and voice performance. So I felt there was a really beautiful connection. But beyond that, there's the connection of breathing. Anyway, so, but I'm very touched that you should hear that perhaps starting to take place, or one way or another, because of the technique used. Even though it's not there mentally, if you like, that it's there in that.
I had a quite specific question about something you said earlier. I think it was about the O pieces with the O's. You said that it wasn't by coincidence that you used the gill sounds, and I wonder why.
Because the gill sounds is a very sort of clear sensory typeface. And it has a perfect O. It's sort of a lot of other O's, even in very clear sensory faces, you might have a more like an oval O. But his O is a circle. And that's just so beautiful. So in that sense, it's literally going to what a typeface can provide of a spatial understanding. And that O really has such a clear sense of space. So quickly it forgets that it could act as part of language, and it can come back to it. So that's why it's such a beautiful letter as part of that phase.
It reminded me of Mira Schendel's work in the sense of having abstract letters.
Oh, right.
And the way it was presented on the wall as well. I really felt that it was like sort of trying to display the story between each other.
Yep.
There's something, I don't know that I can form this into any kind of articulate, intelligent question of some sort, but there's something that strikes me in being inspired by your work up in there, and curious to kind of want to be a little bit more nosy to find out what your practices or how you practice or something along those lines, but to help me in terms of where I'm at, because something keeps coming up for me is if I relate movement as language, as a form of expression, and the different qualities of that, there's something about that can come out as in its different phrasings, or its different rhythms, or its different abstractness, or anyway, something like that. But then there's something about them. There's something about choosing the meaningfulness of something, and I honestly don't quite know what I don't fully know what I mean there, but there was something about when you asked that question, and that you reminded me something about just wanting to find out more about what it is that I do, what it is that we do as a dance of a culture of movement, where it is today. How do we know that? Can we all agree with that? Do we agree? There's all these kind of big things to then come down to the simplicity of what is it that I practice, and what am I tuning into that gives some sense of meaning, and meaning I kind of want to throw open as something else. So I don't know whether that's a question or what, but I think I'm fishing for something at this, and it was inspired.
Thank you. Well, it's impossible to, one can only share thoughts about one's practice, and there is an aspect of it that means very much what you were describing when you were talking about the courage, and that things are passing through you, but that I don't know your name, so, but that there's a courage that things pass through you, and then there's sometimes the courage that they can stay with you as well, and you can work with them, and you do something with them, and then you transform them. There is something about that, a sort of investment in that's, I was about to say the reason for making work, but let's put it differently, investment in that project. Because I think that might make it a little bit simpler. Because really it's project by project that we live, it's step by step. I mean, to be just totally sort of straightforward about it. And we might have a big idea about, well, I know that I'm going to sort of do this later, I can sense it, it's going to be like this. But you still have to sort of, your projects are going to train you. And they're going to make you think, and they're going to teach you how to think. And so there could be gestures that make you feel uncomfortable, there could be gestures that make you feel joyous, and there could be moments in gesture history or whatever. I don't know how much research you do. I was sort of quite careful to say a couple of times that a lot of my work is research based and has a performative basis, because there's so much knowledge we can get from others, but not just our contemporaries, but also what we have from history, and how it's, what it does to us, and in good and bad, and that just that awareness. And by digging down into these little letters or whatever, you uncover these things, and how to then trace them back and take them back for yourself. That kind of traffic, that kind of, at least that's the way I've managed to make sense of it. So big, and I'm so small, but also I'm also so sort of always in the learning process. So you can be quite blinkered somehow as well. So that's one way for me to find an openness, is that to know that, well, there's that investment and there's this project, and then to just spend the time thinking through it, finding my way by whatever, sketching, thinking, walking, talking, and then it does come about that you find that line. I don't know if this...
Yeah, no, it resonates for me a lot, and there's something about, if I was to then bring it back, and maybe this is on a slightly wobblier edge of, okay, well, there's a risk and there's a fear attached to the joy of the physicality of movement for me, but then the pulling it apart, or the zooming into the micro, then allows something for it to not be movement, but then to find the movement in it. And so I go to a still place of I guess where that I guess what I picked up from you then is the mention of research base helps me to sit with something that feels like I'm constantly putting myself in contexts or learning environments that give me some kind of something to bite or to chew at or to examine.
It's a protection as well, because it also allows you to dig deeper. somehow, bizarrely, you can become nearly more open to your own autobiographic sort of difficulties, also by accepting material that is coming from somewhere else, even if that material could be very traumatic. But that you have a connection that can be set up then. And so you are able to handle your own sort of autobiographical terms or difficulties in a slightly more detached way. You can start to look at it also as material, and also as it is making you how you feel anyway, because this happened to you, or your family or whatever. And so that sort of opens up that process a little bit, unpacks it a little bit. But long processes.
I wonder if you could say a bit more about the experience of saying words versus the meaning of, in relation to the meaning of words, the sort of bodily experience of words, and also when you talk about how language sits in the muscle of the jaw or the tongue or the. So whether you could speak a bit more about the body, the experience of languaging, or the experience of the emanation of language, the bodily emanation of language.
Yeah, I think it takes many different forms. Again, there's emanation, there's, or meaning, I wouldn't even use that word emanation actually. There's a type of emergence, type of voicing that is sort of physical, but it could be, again, through this idea of recordings, and I was sort of again pointing to that because it's such an interesting sort of doubling or spatializing of the voice that can happen also through recording, or in fact through a type of setup of miking. I don't have a definitive answer of how it feels to be voicing, because I'm sort of interested in how to spatialize it, how to. So, if you mean in the difference between using language that is more about sounding, or somatic language, or verbal sounds, or vocal sounds rather than verbalization, for example. I haven't done so much of that work, because I have found that having 3 languages in my sort of being, in my sort of resonance, that's enough to create complications in sound anyway. Even if I understand the sounds, there's a lot of excellent complications that I can use. So I haven't needed the imagination, also because then I give out that, and a bit what we were talking about earlier, you give out sound, and then it becomes language to those who can understand it. So I have a slightly, my take on it is, the voicing process is demanding as well, like I was describing, needing to learn how to read to do that piece. And there's always a way by which I have to understand what the piece is wanting me to do physically. I have to come to a point where that is what the piece wants me to do, if it's going to be a sound piece. There's no, now I'm going to stop breathing and that's going to be great in, 10 lines? Yeah, 15 lines. It's always, so what is this thing of holding it or keeping it, or out of which came that process? So my answer again is sort of quite open in a way, but I think language is so vast, and there's always also the somatic, the resonant aspect of language, always. So I think it's difficult to separate, for me anyway, completely. But I'm interested in that opening out that can happen also when you spatialize it, or when you, I think that's absolutely such an interesting thing. I was part of a show just now in India, and I was invited to sort of be one of the voice pieces that were at the entrance, and basically they wanted to put it really high and really loud volume and whatever, but actually you just put the speakers really close and fairly low volume, and it's just, you really walk through the voice, and it's so weird and simple, and it's just the way you place those tiny little things, and it's as though you're walking through a little sort of veil of, it's very bizarre, and it's wonderful, but in sort of real terms, I've engaged with a lot of manipulation of language that has translation that is cool, whether it is me working my way through this Anglo-Saxon text that I've just finally finished without refusing to go to learning it, and it's just been a total nightmare. And allowing for ignorance, allowing for type of research to come into play, all that stuff. That is a process where it was supposed to be writing practice, but it was also about learning to deal with types of ignorance, types of the depth of history at that point, lots of things like that came into play, and it became in many ways something that also deals with translation, that also accepts that I'm not taking that text on necessarily, but I have taken on some structural aspects of it. I've taken on my own panics in front of the text, you know, things like that, which I then consider to be part of this encounter that, you know, that I've forced myself to go through. And otherwise just variations, games with language, sort of, you know, these silly sound games we do where you change the vowel and you let it run, or you change the consonant and you let it run, those kinds of things. I do a lot of that because there's that beauty of the alphabetic language that is based on permutation. So the phoneme is that sign that has a particular sense when placed in that particular context, and then you can say, well, now I'm not going to find one, but you know, they all do it. And so, of course, there's always that flexibility and that sort of, you work at small levels with translation and permutation all the time. So that, and then I do a lot of variations of the work. I do a lot of, anyway, you know, mixes and all those kinds of things where entering another environment or with another collaborator or whatever, I will accept the mix. I sort of, you know.
Must it be variation and permutation, I wonder? The Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben gives an example of repeating again and again the same word. It's something that little children often do. So they repeat a word again and again, glass, 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 glass. Yeah. I think you all have had that experience when you were a small boy or girl. At a certain moment, it is as if the word has no meaning anymore. You have a very strong experience. So in a sense, your words don't signify anything anymore. But at the same time, you have a strong experience that you can speak, that words can have meaning. At the very moment that your words lose meaning, that you have the experience that your words can have meaning. And it is the condition to have this experience is repetition. And not so much permutation or variation, but a mere repetition of the word.
That's very interesting. It's a different process. Permutation, variation also carry a shift in meaning. But that kind of repetition, of course, enters straight into also the world of mantras. So not only children, but also the complete acquired knowledge of mantra practice as something that through a linguistic or verbal sort of entity will also release other meanings or at least other experiences. So it's very interesting to bring that in, I think. Yeah.
I have something that I don't know if it's a question, but I was interested in one of the very first things you said about breath and the connection, and then what you were saying about the keeping it together. But I also didn't feel enclosed. I felt like it was this thing about that, very much about being in the moment, and I felt that every expression of it was keeping one present. But then I started to wonder about the other thing that you said about this, which was that you had learnt then how to control the breath, and this kind of rehearsed and learnt manner of then being with the breath and being with the body. And I was interested in, when you're working with variation, what this, and I'm thinking to the residency as well, what this first moment is like, and what the moment of, I don't know if that's the right word, but I'll use it for now, of being in discovery of something. So what, rather than the learnt way in which to control the breath and repeat these things, what was it? What occurred? What was the occurrence the first time you made this attempt? What happened? what was it that was happening with your breath in that very moment in time? What occurred? What was the discovery in making that variation before one cleaned it up? And I was just thinking about that relative to process and being able to be in a process and be in the moment of process, or be really tired, someone was talking about over there, you know, and that just really brings you to being in it, potentially being in the moment of process. But yeah, my question to you was about this moment of discovery.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you have it all the time with muscles and stretching and warming up, and suddenly a new world has opened because you've gone a bit further or whatever. I mean, you know, these things that happen through skillful practice in a way, that where suddenly I would imagine there's that sort of the pleasure of that discovery, you know, that whoa, we can go much further. And what that might do mentally as well, to discover the reach, and that the reach has not stopped. It's the same here. I started hyperventilating and nearly passed out, so I thought, okay, so that's not the right way to do it. So you then start measuring and sort of, you know, thinking about these things and applying other skills that I might have from singing and from meditation and whatever, and you sort of remind yourself that, oh, you went a bit quick on that one, you know, like, and so, you know, it's also checking in.
It's 5 to 5.
Can I just say one tiny thing?
I was going to say, yeah, there's maybe just time for one or maybe two more.
Just a thread that went through for me, which I think is really relevant for us, is that phrase, "You're not where the work is." I thought that was just great for the breath, for what we're doing here. Yeah, so.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you everybody for being here. And I think dinner's probably just about served.
Great.
Thank you.